Mail-order bride arrived in rags on Christmas Eve. The single father saw her worth and chose her. Train platform, Willow Creek, Montana Territory, December 24, 1887. Snow drifted in slow circles from the lavender sky as the evening train hissed into the Willow Creek station. The air smelled of coal smoke and pine, and Christmas lanterns glowed in a warm row along the wooden platform. Families bustled around, claiming parcels and greeting loved ones before the line shut down for the holiday. Caleb Hawkins stood a little apart from the crowd, his gloved hands hooked in his coat pockets, watching the passengers spill out one by one. His heart thudded with an uneasiness he'd been carrying all day. He'd reread the matchmaker's letter so many times the creases were worn soft. Marin O'Donnell, 28. Of respectable upbringing. Capable and steady. Prepared for frontier life. Prepared. He reminded himself of that word. Prepared for him, for Lucy, for the ranch. He hoped it was true. A widower did not send for a bride lightly. Especially not on Christmas Eve. Then, as the last of the well-dressed travelers stepped aside, a thin woman emerged from the final car. Her boots were scuffed nearly through, and the hem of her brown dress was frayed from long miles of wear. Her coat hung loosely, patched in more places than it was intact. She carried a single small satchel. No trunk, no hat box, none of the belongings a bride usually brought to start a new life. For a heartbeat, Caleb told himself she could not possibly be the woman he'd sent for. But when her gaze found his, cautious, hopeful and tired to the bone, she walked toward him. "Mr. Caleb Hawkins?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." "I'm Marin O'Donnell," she said, her voice carrying a soft lilt that hinted at faraway shores. She stood straight despite the cold, despite the worn edges of her life being visible to everyone on that platform. Caleb opened his mouth to speak, but before he could manage a single word, Lucy darted from behind him. "Are you the lady who's gonna live with us?" his daughter asked, her mittens swinging excitedly from her wrists. Marin blinked, startled by the child, but knelt anyway, carefully as though not used to anyone rushing toward her with friendliness. Up close, Caleb saw the truth more clearly. Exhaustion beneath her eyes, a small scar along her jaw, hair that had been pinned neatly hours ago but had since lost the fight to the wind. And yet there was something gentle about her. Something steady. "You must be Lucy," she murmured. "Your father told me so much about you." Lucy grinned proudly, wiping her nose with her mitten. "We saved the last ornament on the tree for you." Emotion flickered across Marin's face, surprise first, then something like disbelief and finally, a soft warmth she seemed almost afraid to show. Caleb cleared his throat. "Miss O'Donnell, you didn't bring a trunk?" Marin rose to her feet and met his gaze squarely, though embarrassment shaded her cheeks. "No," she said simply. "This is all I have." The words weren't an apology. They were a truth she'd learned to accept. Caleb felt the sting of the townspeople's stares. A few murmured remarks drifted across the platform, speculation wrapped in judgment. He forced his jaw to loosen before it locked into anger. "It's cold," he said finally. "Let's get you home." For a moment she looked as though she might protest, afraid that he'd misjudged her, afraid she would be turned away after coming all this distance. But something in his tone must have reassured her, because she nodded and handed him the satchel. When her fingers touched his glove, he felt how cold her hand was, cold enough to tremble. He helped her up into the wagon. Lucy climbed in beside her without hesitation, chattering about the cookies cooling on the kitchen counter and the cedar tree waiting in the parlor. Marin listened intently, as though each word was a gift she didn't know how to unwrap. As the wagon rolled away from the station, Caleb took one last glance at the quiet woman beside his daughter. No, she wasn't the bride he'd imagined. She wasn't fine or polished or outfitted for a new beginning. But the way she listened, the way she softened at Lucy's voice, the way she carried herself with dignity even while wrapped in rags. Something about her tugged at a place inside him he thought grief had sealed shut. And as snow fell softly over the valley and Christmas Eve settled around them like a warm blanket, Caleb felt a whisper inside his chest, a small, unexpected stirring of hope. The Hawkins ranch sat nestled in a quiet fold of the valley, snow banked high along the fences and the barn roof shimmering beneath the pale moonlight. By the time Caleb guided the wagon to a stop near the porch, the wind had picked up, brushing cold across his cheeks and whipping loose snow into little ghostly spirals. Marin climbed down carefully, clutching her thin coat tighter around her as she looked up at the house. Her breath formed soft clouds in the air. The farmhouse wasn't large or fancy, but the windows glowed with lamplight, and the smell of wood smoke drifted from the chimney, warm, welcoming, alive. To a woman who had arrived with nothing more than a single satchel, it must have looked like a kingdom. Inside, the warmth hit her like a physical embrace. The parlor was modest but tidy, with braided rugs on the floor and shelves crowded with little wooden toys Caleb had carved for Lucy. A small cedar tree stood near the hearth, decorated with simple ornaments, tin stars, bits of dried orange peel and crimson ribbons cut from an old dress. Marin paused in the doorway, almost afraid to step in. "It's not fine," Caleb said, hanging his coat on the peg almost apologetically. "But it's home." "It's beautiful," Marin whispered. Lucy tugged her hand eagerly. "Come see the cookies. I helped cut the shapes." In the kitchen, the table held a plate of sugar cookies dusted with uneven sprinkles. Marin stared at them as though she'd stumbled upon a treasure. She reached for one slowly, as if careful not to seem greedy. Caleb noticed. "You don't have to be shy," he said softly. She nodded, though he could see the tension in her shoulders. Hunger lived somewhere inside her, quiet, well-disciplined, practiced. She took a single cookie, broke it in half, and let Lucy choose a piece. They sat at the table for a small Christmas Eve supper. Warm stew, crusty bread, and late-season apples baked with cinnamon. Marin ate in tiny, measured bites, her posture straight, her eyes lowered. Every so often she flinched at a loud noise, the thump of a log tossed on the fire, Lucy's excited bursts of chatter, even Caleb's chair scraping the floor. He noticed everything. He noticed the calluses on her hands, working hands, scrubbing hands, not the hands of a woman of proper upbringing, as the matchmaker had claimed. He noticed how she kept her back toward the wall, as if she needed something solid at her spine. And he noticed how she kept glancing at him like she expected to be told she'd eaten too much, or said the wrong thing, or made a mistake. Something twisted inside him at that. When Lucy excused herself to place the last ribbon on the tree, Caleb poured Marin a cup of coffee, though he watered it down for her sake. She wrapped her fingers around the warm tin cup gratefully. "I should be honest with you, Mr. Hawkins," she said at last, her voice soft. "I know I wasn't what you expected to meet at the station." Caleb met her gaze across the table. "I expected a woman who'd come all this way to build a life. And that's you." Marin seemed startled by the gentleness in his tone. "Still," she continued, "I understand if you wish to reconsider matters." Lucy burst back into the kitchen before Caleb could respond, clutching a handful of ribbon scraps. "Pa, she needs to see her room." Caleb cleared his throat and gestured for Marin to follow. He led her down the hall to the room he'd meant to prepare for a stranger who would someday be a wife. It wasn't grand, just a small chamber with a quilt on the bed, a simple dresser, and a rug Lucy had braided herself with her tiny hands. Caleb hesitated at the door before lighting the lamp. "This room was Emma's," he said quietly. "My late wife." Marin looked at the quilt, hand-stitched, delicate, worn with years of loving use. "I can sleep anywhere," she murmured. "Truly." "I know," he said. "But you'll sleep here tonight." Her lips parted slightly in surprise. "Thank you," she whispered, voice catching. Caleb stepped back, half lost in the shadows of the hallway. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, not between him and this woman who had arrived in rags, carrying the weight of secrets she hadn't yet spoken aloud. He only knew that the thought of sending her to some drafty spare room had felt wrong in every way. Marin ran her fingers along the quilt's stitching, reverent, as though touching something sacred. "I'll do my best to be useful," she said. "I know that's what I was sent for." Caleb frowned slightly at the phrasing, not married, not partner, but useful. He opened his mouth to correct her, to tell her she wasn't a hired hand or a machine brought west to fill a gap in his home, but Lucy's laugh rang from the parlor, breaking the moment. "You'll find your place here," was all he managed. Marin nodded, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. Later, long after Lucy had fallen asleep under the glow of the Christmas tree, Caleb walked past Marin's room and saw a faint light beneath the door. He paused, listening. Inside, Marin was kneeling beside the bed, hands clasped tight, whispering a prayer he couldn't make out. But he heard the tremble in her voice. The hope. The fear. He stepped away before she knew he'd heard. And as he banked the fire and locked the door against the cold night, he found himself thinking of her soft voice, her careful movements, and the way she'd reached out to Lucy at the station without hesitation. Maybe she had arrived with nothing. But maybe, just maybe, she was everything the Hawkins household needed. Morning arrived softly over the Hawkins ranch, the kind of pale, pearly dawn that turned the world into something hushed and holy. Frost rimmed the windows, and the fields beyond the house shimmered under a blanket of untouched snow. Caleb rose early out of habit. He expected a quiet start to the day, the kind where he'd stoke the fire and prepare for chores before Lucy stirred. But when he stepped into the hallway, he noticed something unusual, the faint scent of wood smoke drifting not from the stove but from the barn. He frowned. No one should be out in that cold yet. Pulling on his coat, he walked across the packed snow toward the barn, boots crunching beneath him. As he drew closer, he heard the unmistakable scrape of a shovel and the rhythmic slosh of water being hauled. He pushed the barn door open. There, illuminated by the soft gold of lantern light, stood Marin. Her thin dress was tucked into borrowed boots several sizes too large, her sleeves rolled past her elbows. She carried 2 heavy buckets of water across the floor with surprising steadiness, her breath forming small puffs of mist in the frigid air. For a moment, Caleb simply watched her. She didn't move like a lady raised in comfort. She moved like someone used to labor before sunrise. "Marin," he said finally, stepping inside. "You don't have to do that. These chores, they're not your responsibility." She startled at his voice, nearly sloshing the water before she steadied herself. "Oh, Mr. Hawkins." She set the buckets down carefully. "I didn't mean to overstep. I just couldn't sleep and I thought helping might be a way to earn my keep." Her words were plain, factual. But they struck him deeply, not because she'd overstepped, but because she believed she had something to prove before she even settled into the home. "You don't owe me labor," Caleb replied, softer now. "You're not a hired hand." "No," she said quietly. "But I'm not a wife either. Not yet. And I thought it best to show I'm not a burden." A burden. The way she said the word, lightly like something she had been called before, made Caleb's throat tighten. "You're a guest," he insisted. "And guests rest on winter mornings." She gave a small, strained smile. "Some of us aren't very good at resting." Before Caleb could ask what she meant, the barn door opened again, this time briskly and without hesitation. In stepped Mrs. Agnes Whitley, wrapped in a thick shawl, her sharp eyes darting immediately between Caleb and Marin. Mrs. Whitley had a nose for trouble and a tongue as quick as prairie wind. "Morning, Caleb," she said, though her gaze was fixed on Marin. "Came to drop off some sewing for Lucy's school Christmas pageant." Her eyes narrowed. "Didn't expect to see a lady out doing chores at this hour." Marin straightened but said nothing. Her hands folded neatly in front of her, hiding the rawness on her knuckles. Caleb stepped forward. Marin was just helping out. No need to make anything of it. But Mrs. Whitley's stare sharpened. "O'Donnell, you said?" she asked, voice dropping. "From back east." "Yes, ma'am," Marin answered, polite but cautious. Mrs. Whitley sniffed. "Well, I've done work for the charity homes in Boston. They send women west from time to time, girls with nowhere to go, no family, no prospects. Often poor. Damaged." Marin flinched ever so slightly at the word damaged. Caleb felt his jaw clench. "Agnes." "It's just something to be aware of," she interrupted. "A man ought to know a woman's background. Especially if she arrives with only a satchel to her name." With that, she handed him a bundle of cloth, shot Marin another pointed look and left, the door closing behind her with a thud. Silence filled the barn. Marin didn't lift her head. Instead, she braced her hands on the nearest stall, steadying herself as though the simple act of staying on her feet required effort. Caleb stepped closer. "You can ignore Agnes Whitley. She likes to hear herself talk." "Sometimes talk has truth in it," Marin said quietly, not looking up. "Sometimes people see more than they know." He waited, letting the space between them settle. At last she spoke again, voice small. "I didn't grow up with much. And charity homes, they're not like people imagine. They're not places of warmth or kindness. They're practical. Efficient." She exhaled shakily. "Girls learn to work or they learn to go hungry." It explained the calluses. The way she worked faster than she should. The way she flinched at raised voices or sudden movement. She had learned to survive, not to live. "How long were you there?" Caleb asked gently. "Long enough." She brushed dust from her hands. "But I wasn't running to a husband. I was running from a life where I was never more than a number in a ledger." Caleb felt something inside him shift, anger at the world that had shaped her, and admiration for the strength she didn't even realize she possessed. "Marin," he said quietly, "you deserve more than ledger space." She blinked, surprised by the kindness in his voice. "I don't know what I deserve," she replied honestly. "But I do know the life I want is better than the one behind me." Caleb nodded. "Then let's take things one day at a time. No rush. No expectations you have to meet." She looked at him for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, uncertainty, hope, and perhaps a cautious gratitude. "All right," she whispered. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of church bells from town. Christmas Eve services were beginning. Families gathering. Songs rising. Inside the barn, Caleb realized something he hadn't expected. Maren O'Donnell wasn't just a woman in rags. She wasn't a burden or a mistake or a mystery to fear. She was a story waiting to be told. And he was beginning, not unwillingly, to want to be part of it. By midday, the sky had shifted from pale winter blue to a heavy iron gray. The kind of gray that swallowed the horizon and promised more than a simple snowfall. Caleb had lived in Montana territory long enough to read the sky like a ledger. A storm was coming. The kind that didn't knock politely, it barged in and stayed until it pleased. He hurried to bring in firewood before the wind picked up. Maren helped without being asked, carrying armfuls of split pine from the pile by the barn to the porch. Twice he told her she didn't need to be out in the cold. Twice she ignored him with a polite but firm, "I'm fine." And she was, except for the flush on her cheeks and the way her breath puffed in ragged little clouds. By late afternoon, the storm arrived. It swept down the valley like a beast unleashed, wind howling like wolves at the door. Snow fell in thick sheets, slantwise and relentless. The house shuddered under each gust, and the windows rattled in their frames. Inside, the world turned small and intimate. A circle of lamplight, the crackle of the stove, the scent of pine logs burning. Caleb checked every window twice, securing the shutters. Maren helped him lower blankets over the doors to keep drafts at bay. Lucy fluttered behind them, excited at first by the drama of it all. But as evening deepened, excitement faded. Lucy began to cough. At first it was a little thing, a dry, scratchy cough she brushed off with a laugh. But then she pressed a hand to her chest, wincing. When they sat down for supper, she barely touched her food. Her face looked too pale, her eyes too bright. Caleb's heart clenched. He had lived this fear before. Emma had begun the same way, quiet cough, waning appetite, fever rising slow but sure. He felt the old panic creep in, cold and familiar. "Maren," he said, keeping his voice steady, "I'm going to get her bed warmed. Could you?" But she was already at Lucy's side, one hand sweeping gently over the girl's forehead. "She's warm," Maren murmured, brows knitting. "Will you fetch blankets? And a basin? I'll see to her." Caleb froze. Not because she stepped in, he was grateful for that, but because she did it without fear, without hesitation, as if she'd tended sick children her whole life. He hurried to obey, grateful to have something to do. When he returned, Maren was humming softly, her voice low and melodic, an Irish lullaby Caleb didn't recognize. She dipped a cloth into cool water and laid it across Lucy's brow with such tender care that it stopped him in his tracks. Lucy leaned toward her instinctively, seeking comfort. "What do we do?" Caleb asked, trying not to let the tremor in his voice show. "We watch her," Maren said calmly. "We cool her fever. We keep her close. Illness can move fast in children, but it can move away fast too." He swallowed. "My wife, Emma, she..." Maren placed a steadying hand on his arm. "This is not that," she said, her tone firm in a way he hadn't heard from her before. "Lucy is young and strong. And she's not alone." Her words steadied something inside him. They settled together by Lucy's bedside. Hours passed in quiet vigil. Outside, the storm raged like a living thing. Inside, the little bedroom became a sanctuary of soft lamplight, whispered prayers, and shared purpose. From time to time Caleb caught Maren watching him, measuring him, or perhaps reassuring herself that he was still holding together. He didn't know. He only knew her presence was anchoring him in a moment where he would otherwise be drowning. At one point Lucy stirred. "Pa?" Caleb leaned close. "I'm here, sweetheart." Maren stroked Lucy's hair. "Try to rest now. I'm right here too." Lucy's small fingers reached out and curled around Maren's hand. The sight of it nearly undid him. Sometime past midnight the fever broke. Lucy's breathing eased, her body relaxing into true sleep. Maren finally exhaled in relief, shoulders sagging, as though she had been holding up the entire house with sheer will. "She'll be better in the morning," Maren said quietly. Caleb nodded, emotion thick in his throat. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't know what I would have done without you." She blinked, startled as though the idea of being needed was foreign to her. "I only did what anyone would," she murmured. But the way her voice trembled slightly said otherwise. "Not anyone," he replied. "You." A faint color rose in her cheeks, not embarrassment but something softer. A recognition that she'd been seen. Truly seen. He pulled a blanket over Lucy, brushing a loose braid away from her cheek. Then, when he looked up, he found Marin watching him with a strange, unreadable expression, somewhere between admiration and fear. As though the night had shifted something in her too. Outside the storm still howled. But inside, something warmer had begun to take root. Something fragile and tentative but no less real. A quiet bond, born in the middle of a winter storm. The storm finally passed sometime before dawn, leaving behind a world transformed, quiet, white and glittering under the newborn sun. Snow lay drifted high against fences, barns and porch steps, smoothing out the familiar ranch yard into a soft rolling sea. Caleb stepped outside after checking on Lucy, who was still drowsy but noticeably improved. His boots broke through the crust of snow with a satisfying crunch. He inhaled deeply. The air smelled sharp and clean, the kind of cold that woke a man straight to his soul. But beneath the calm beauty, a troubling sight caught his eye. A long stretch of the south fence was buried under a collapsed drift, the weight of the storm snapping several posts clean through. And beyond that, a churned patch of snow revealed something worse: hoofprints. Fresh ones. Some of the cattle had already wandered out. Caleb muttered a curse under his breath. Fences were lifelines out here, and strayed cattle meant lost money, or worse, animals left to freeze or fall prey to wolves. He turned toward the house to fetch his coat and gear. Marin was standing on the porch. She had her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, snow dusting her hair and lashes. She looked pale from worry and lack of sleep, but steady on her feet. "How's Lucy?" Caleb asked. "She's resting peacefully. She asked for you." Her eyes softened. "But she's well enough now for you to step away." Caleb nodded. "The south fence is down. Some cattle got out. I'll need to go after them." Marin didn't hesitate. "I'll ride with you." He blinked. "No, absolutely not. You need to rest. And you're not dressed for it besides." He gestured to her thin shawl. "You'll freeze before we reach the ridge." She squared her shoulders. "Then give me something warmer." "Marin." Her voice dropped, quiet but unshakable. "Caleb, you can't do it alone. The drift is too deep. You need another set of hands." He opened his mouth to argue and stopped. Because she was right. And because he saw something in her eyes he recognized. She needed to help. Needed to prove her worth, not out of pride, but out of a deeper fear that he hadn't fully understood until now. Without another word, he retrieved an extra coat from the peg inside the door, Emma's old winter coat. He hesitated, then held it out. Marin accepted it with both hands, her expression a mixture of gratitude and something more fragile. "It's warm," he said simply. She slipped it on. It hung a little loose, but she pulled the collar close and looked almost surprised by the weight of it. Together they saddled the horses. The cold bit at their fingers and stiffened the leather reins, but neither complained. When they finally mounted up, Marin settled into the saddle with practiced ease. Caleb noticed. "You've ridden before." "A bit," she replied. "I helped with deliveries back east when the charity home needed girls to work for their keep." He didn't know whether to feel relieved or angered on her behalf. The trail to the south ridge was rough, snow knee-high in places, hidden ice beneath the drifts. The wind had quieted, but the cold still clawed at exposed skin. Caleb rode ahead at first. Marin followed close, her posture upright and sure, though her cheeks turned red from the cold. "Caleb," she called after a long silence. "Do you think Mrs. Whitley was right? That people might talk?" He slowed his horse so she could ride beside him. "People always talk," he said. "Doesn't mean they know a thing." She gave a half-smile. "I suppose not." But he heard the hurt beneath her words. Before he could say more, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Ahead, near a rocky outcrop dusted with snow, 3 of his cattle stood huddled together, sides crusted in frost. They rode toward them, guiding the animals with calm voices and light pressure from their reins. Marin's horse startled when one of the cattle slipped on ice, but she steadied him with a quick, confident tug. "You handle yourself well," Caleb remarked. "I've had to," she replied simply. He didn't press her for more. They circled around the last straggler, a large steer that stumbled into a dip in the snow. Marin dismounted without hesitation. "Marin, wait." But she was already knee-deep in the drift, hands pressed firm against the animal's flank. "Come on, boy," she murmured. "Up we go. That's it." Her voice was low and soothing, and the steer surprisingly responded. Together, with calm determination, she coaxed the beast up and out of the depression. Caleb watched in astonishment. She wasn't strong, at least not in the obvious, muscular way. But she had a steadiness to her. A grit that didn't shout but held fast like bedrock. When the steer finally lurched to its feet and ambled toward the others, Marin exhaled and leaned forward, bracing her hands on her knees. "You all right?" Caleb asked, stepping off his horse and crunching through the snow toward her. She nodded, though her breath was shaky. "Just winded." But as she stood, her boot caught on hidden ice. She stumbled forward. Caleb caught her before she fell. His hands closed around her arms, gentle, steadying. She grasped his coat, breath trembling in the cold air between them. For a moment, they were close enough for him to see the faint freckles across her nose, the glimmer of uncertainty in her eyes, the way her lashes held tiny crystals of snow. "You should have let me handle that," he said softly. "And let you do everything alone?" she countered just as softly. Their breath mingled in the icy air. Something unspoken passed between them, warmth in the cold, familiarity where there shouldn't be any. Then Marin stepped back, her cheeks more flushed than the cold alone could explain. "I'm fine," she said again, though her voice wavered. Caleb nodded, clearing his throat. "Let's get these cattle home." They rode back in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Instead it felt changed, as though the snow-covered world around them had shifted in some imperceptible way. When they reached the ranch yard, Marin slid from her horse and returned Emma's coat carefully, almost reverently. "Thank you," she said, "for trusting me out there." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "No," he corrected gently. "Thank you." Marin held his gaze, something warm and vulnerable flickering in her eyes. Then Lucy, awake and lively again, burst from the door calling for them, breaking the moment into soft fragments. But the shiver that ran through Marin wasn't from the cold. And the way Caleb looked at her had changed. For both of them, something undeniable had begun. The days that followed passed gently, as though the storm had ushered in not just snow, but a quieter season of understanding. The ranch, wrapped in white silence, felt almost like a place suspended outside of time. Chores were done slowly, evenings lingered long by the fire, and for the first time since Marin's arrival, the Hawkins house felt like a place where she belonged, even if she didn't dare believe it fully. Lucy regained her strength quickly, darting around the house like a winter sparrow set free from its cage. She followed Marin constantly, tugging at her skirts, asking questions, chattering about the upcoming Christmas supper they would have once the roads cleared. Caleb watched all of this with a quiet, contemplative gaze. He noticed everything: how Marin knelt to braid Lucy's hair each morning, how she hummed when she cooked, how she moved through the house with the tentative reverence of someone who expected the floor to be taken out from beneath her at any moment. And he noticed how she looked at him sometimes, quick glances, fleeting as snowflakes, before she turned her eyes away, almost as if she was afraid she had no right to look longer. One evening, after the sun had dipped behind the snowy hills and cast the house into a warm amber glow, Caleb found Marin in the kitchen mending Lucy's coat. The small girl had torn the sleeve earlier while playing near the woodpile. Now, Marin sat by the stove with needle and thread, tiny even stitches running along the tear so neatly they were almost invisible. Caleb leaned against the doorway, arms crossed loosely over his chest. "You're good at that," he said. Marin didn't look up right away. Her fingers continued their careful work. "When you grow up with little," she replied, "you learn to make each thing last." He stepped closer, watching the dexterity of her hands. They were hands that had seen hardship, calloused, scraped, but they moved with remarkable gentleness. "Still," he said, "Lucy's gotten used to me patching her things, and my sewing looks like a drunk man stitched it in the dark." A soft laugh slipped from her, unguarded. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh freely. The sound warmed him in a way he hadn't expected. She paused, glancing up at him through her lashes. "You're kind to her," she said. "She knows she's loved. That's what matters." Caleb smiled, a faint but genuine curve of his lips. "Doesn't feel like enough sometimes." "It's more than some children ever get," Marin whispered, her voice quieting as if the words were memories pressing against her ribs. He hesitated, then pulled out the chair opposite her. The lantern light flickered across the table, casting gold across her hair, revealing the underlying copper strands that glowed like embers. "Marin," he said gently, "I know life hasn't been easy for you, but you don't have to prove anything here." She stilled, needle hovering above the fabric. "I'm trying to be useful," she said softly, eyes lowering. I don't want to be sent away." His chest tightened. "Who said anything about sending you away?" Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. She set the needle aside, folding the coat carefully before speaking. "I've been in places where people decided my fate without ever asking what I wanted," she said quietly. Homes. Work placements. Charity houses. One day you're allowed to stay, the next you're told there's no room, no funds, no use for you. It becomes easier to stay prepared. Easier to stay small. Caleb reached across the table instinctively, but stopped an inch short, hesitating. He didn't want to frighten her. Still she met his gaze. And he saw it there, the belief that she could be discarded, that she was something replaceable, that her worth came from what she could offer rather than who she was. "Marin," he said slowly, "look at me." She did. It was the first time she'd held his eyes this long, and the moment hummed with something unspoken. "You weren't what I expected when you stepped off that train," he admitted. Her shoulders dipped subtly as if bracing for the rest. "You're more." Her breath caught. He continued, voice low and steady. "I've watched you these past days. You work hard, you care deeply, and you fit into this house in ways I didn't see coming. Not because you tried, but because it's who you are." Marin's eyes glistened, though she blinked the shine away quickly. "I don't want to send you on to another home come spring," Caleb went on. "I want you here. But not because I paid for a match. Not because the ranch needs another set of hands." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something rawer. "I want you here because I choose you. Because I see your worth. Not what you do, you." For a long moment only the stove crackled between them. Marin's lips trembled and she looked down at her hands as if unsure what to do with them. "Caleb," she whispered. "No one has ever chosen me for anything but work." "Well," he said gently, "they were fools." She gave a shaky laugh, half fragile, half incredulous. He stood then, slowly rounding the table. Marin watched him approach, eyes wide, unsure but not frightened. He knelt, picking up the coat she'd mended, running his thumb along the seam. "These stitches," he said quietly, "are careful. Steady. They'll hold." Marin swallowed. "So will we," he added, looking up at her. "If you want that." She didn't speak for several seconds. Her hand rose, then faltered, then finally rested lightly on the edge of the table. "I want to be chosen," she whispered, barely audible. "But I want to be chosen freely. Not out of obligation." He nodded once, firmly. "Then I choose you freely, Marin O'Donnell." A small tear slipped down her cheek, surprising her as much as him. She brushed it away quickly, embarrassed. "Forgive me," she murmured. "I'm not used to having anything worth crying over." Caleb reached out then, slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, and gently touched her hand. "You're worth a great deal," he said softly. Her fingers curled around his, tentative but willing. And in that moment, in the warm glow of the kitchen with snow piled high against the windows and the scent of pine lingering from the fire, something shifted between them. Something delicate, honest, and undeniably alive. Not obligation. Not arrangement. But the beginning of chosen love. Snow fell lightly over the Hawkins ranch, soft flakes drifting in lazy circles as if the sky were exhaling contentment. The world was hushed under winter's blanket, touched by the magic that only Christmas Eve seemed to carry. Inside the house, the warmth was immediate and comforting. Pine-scented air filled the rooms, and the crackling fire sent golden light flickering across the walls. Marin stood by the parlor window, watching the gentle snowfall. Her hands rested loosely against the sill, and a faint smile curved her lips. A year. It had been a full year since she stepped off that train in rags. A year since she'd knelt before a curious little girl and met the quiet-eyed rancher who would change the course of her life. A year since she'd dared to hope for a place, a real place, where she could belong. And she had found it here. Behind her came the soft patter of Lucy's steps, no longer the uncertain, fever-weary steps of last Christmas, but the lively skip of a well-loved child. "Ma," Lucy chirped, holding up the tin star that had sat atop their Christmas tree every year. "Come help me put it up." Marin turned. Even after months of being called that simple word, "Ma," it still warmed her chest. She bent to kiss Lucy's forehead, brushing the curls from her face. "Of course I will, sweetheart. Let's do it together." Caleb entered the parlor just as they approached the tree. His gaze softened, like it always did now, watching them move as naturally as if they'd been meant for one another from the beginning. Marin lifted Lucy so the girl could reach the top branch. The little hands placed the tin star with triumphant satisfaction. The tree glittered in the lamplight, each ribbon and ornament reflecting memories. A year of mended fences, shared breakfasts, laughter echoing in the barn, quiet night talks over cups of coffee, and moments when hands brushed just a second longer than necessary. Caleb stepped closer, lightly placing his hand against Marin's back. A simple gesture. An anchor. A promise without words. "You two make a fine team," he said quietly. Maren glanced at him, eyes glowing in the warm flicker of the fire. "We're a family," she said simply. And she meant it with every part of her. Caleb reached down, taking her hand in his. His thumb brushed the back of her knuckles. She felt the familiar tingle that never failed to rise when he touched her, the same feeling she'd fought for months before she finally surrendered to it. "I was thinking," he began, his voice soft yet sure, "that last Christmas we were strangers trying to learn each other's steps." He paused, smile warm. "But this year, I can't imagine home without you." The word struck something deep in Maren. A memory flickered, kneeling in a cold room back east, praying for a miracle that felt more like wishful yearning. And here she was, standing in the heart of a home she'd never dared dream she could have. Caleb turned her gently toward him, his fingertips resting under her chin, guiding her gaze up to his. "You walked off that train with nothing but hope," he said. "I didn't see it at first. I didn't understand what that kind of hope costs a person. But Maren, it was worth more than I knew." Her breath caught, emotion tightening her throat. She reached up, touching the side of his face with a tenderness born of shared days and long-kept secrets finally released. "And you," she whispered, "gave me something I'd never had, a home. A family. My own name spoken with kindness." He leaned in slowly, giving her time, giving her choice. Maren's heart fluttered, not with fear but with the deepest sense of rightness she had ever known. She closed the last inch between them, her lips brushing his in a soft, warm kiss that held gratitude, promise, and a love woven through the quiet moments of a year spent healing together. Lucy clapped behind them. "Again?" she giggled. Maren felt her cheeks flush as she turned, laughing. But Caleb didn't release her hand. Instead, he held it firmly, threading their fingers together. "Come on," he said. "I've got something to show you both." He led them to the kitchen door, pulling it open just enough for them to see a small wooden box resting on the snowy porch. Its lid was carved with delicate vines and stars, Caleb's handiwork. "What is it?" Maren asked softly. Caleb stepped outside, retrieving the box and placing it in her hands. She lifted the lid carefully. Inside lay a pair of finely stitched gloves, soft, warm, made of good leather. But beneath them was something else, a folded paper. Her breath trembled as she unfolded it. A marriage license. Their names already written. Caleb's voice was quiet but strong behind her. "Last year I didn't ask you properly. Not the way you deserved. Not with choice. Not with respect. This time, I'm asking." Maren turned, hands pressed to her lips, tears sparkling like the snow outside. "Caleb." He stepped closer, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Maren O'Donnell Hawkins," he said, her full name like a vow. "Will you be my wife? Not because you must or because life left you few choices, but because you choose me? Because you want this life with us." She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, with steady conviction, "Yes, Caleb. I choose you. I choose this home. I choose our family." Caleb pulled her into his arms, carefully at first, then with the deep certainty of a man who'd finally found what he'd been missing. Lucy hugged them both around the knees, laughing and shouting, "We're all together. We're all together." Snow continued falling softly outside, blanketing the valley in shimmering white. And inside the warm glow of the Hawkins home, a family stood wrapped in love, born not of convenience or arrangement, but of courage, healing, and the simple miracle of choosing one another. It was, without question, the finest Christmas they had ever known.